This episode of the Forge Podcast is brought to you by the generous donations of Theo Fattel and Brady Turner, along with all of our other amazing Patreon supporters. If you would like to become part of the Forge community, you can learn more at patreon.com/Forge Genesys. Thank you.
Correctly with the correct amount.
D20 Radio, where gamers roll.
www.d20radio.com.
Welcome to the Forge.
Hello, Gamer Nation, and welcome to the Forge, a Genesys RPG podcast covering everything that you need to know about the latest and greatest from Fantasy Flight Games' Genesys Foundry and the Genesys Role Playing Game. I'm your host, GM Hurley, and it's been a while, but we have an episode tonight that is going to put the pedal to the metal and crank up the NOS and shift into top gear so we can go super fast and stuff. Yeah, I really still don't know anything about cars. But anyway, I really don't. But I do know about exciting vehicle maneuvers in Genesys, and we'll be taking a few hairpin turns around that topic as we continue our multi-show discussion on vehicles in the Genesys role-playing game In the Furnace. We'll also be introducing a brand new show segment tonight where we welcome a special guest for his first time, and hopefully it'll be far from his last appearance, to walk us all through his monumental task of converting one of the most popular and fan-loved RPG settings in the past 20 years into Genesys. And of course, we'll be answering your games and rules questions in Under the Hammer. For now, however, let me introduce you to the fellow so mellow that the police tried to arrest him for street racing, then took one look and ticketed him for driving too slowly instead. It's GM Chris. How you doing, man?
Oh man, I'm a little sick. It's not the COVIDs, but I'm a little under the weather, but I'm okay.
Yeah.
Been looking forward to this show though.
I've had a few of those little sniffles as well, a couple of times since we've last spoken, recorded on the show. Yeah, I've been tested for COVID twice, and I definitely don't have COVID. So,
well, you can get tested easily where you live. You know,
yeah, we just do a drive-through. It's great.
Yeah, here, our government seems to be hoarding the tests, which is fantastic.
We're not going to get political, are we?
Well, this isn't political. This is just the news, or it's fake news, I guess, depending on who you're talking about. But you know what we are talking about?
What are we talking about, Chris?
Genesys.
Strangely enough.
And this show, and actually, I'm kind of excited. We have, we've got to talk about an exciting announcement kind of before we get into things, guys, regarding this show and kind of our ongoing format. Because starting with tonight's episode, we are making some changes.
Damn right we are. When Chris and I first brainstormed this podcast last summer, we had a rough idea of the segments that we wanted to have in the show, how long they were going to be, and how the show would basically flow. But now, some 10 months later, we've produced these, we've listened, and we've learned, and we've noticed that the segment, which, we love producing as we do, and we don't really want to change them. But we understand that everything that we're doing has evolved into larger and larger efforts. Not only does this have an impact of creating incredibly long shows that, while some of you do enjoy them, they are truly difficult to plow through in one or two sittings. And to be perfectly frank, are also a nightmare to edit.
And to write.
Right. Right?
No kidding. So, guys, to that end, Gamer Nation, we are officially shortening the format of our regular episodes. We are still going to do all of the segments you love, just not all 5 segments within each episode.
Chris, I just think I heard hundreds of fans sighing out in relief. I think something amazing has just happened.
Right. So listen, guys, basically each show we plan to do the following, for until we decide to change it again, I guess. We plan to continue to provide announcements and new product featurettes in Stoking the Fire, and also answer listener questions in Under the Hammer every single episode. But in addition to that, rather than do 3 additional segments, we're going to alternate the meat of our show between die casting, which is obviously our talent and skill focused talks, and the furnace, which is our mechanical deep dive segment. We are also going to be alternating Breaking the Mold, our Foundry author interview segment, with a brand new segment Hooli teased a moment ago that will air for the first time on this very episode tonight. And it's something we've been planning for quite some time.
And I cannot wait for this. But yes, our goal is basically to keep these shows at around about 2 hours or less instead of, 4 hours as we have done in the past. So it also means that we can do more regular episodes as well because, 4 hours, it literally does take 20 hours to edit. Because of the a lot of people do compliment us on how the episodes sound and how they've been edited. So, to keep that the way that we've always done things, to keep that in focus, so that people don't have to listen to what sounds like people talking around a table in the one microphone. That I really like to take the time and effort to do that. So yeah, but. You can really expect a bit more variety and slightly shorter shows from now on. Additionally, this will give us more time to spend with our Patreons who help contribute to the show because I know that they've been sort of asking for a little bit more of our attention as well, which is great. And we really want to give back to them because they are really supporting us. So yeah.
And keeping us alive, which is more incredible.
Yeah.
But this is awesome sauce. So Hooli, in the interest of that 2 hour mark, God only knows if we'll get there this episode, but we're going to try.
Yep.
And we got a task ahead of us because, boy, do we have a lot to get into in the Foundry, in terms of what's new.
Oh, yes.
There's a lot new. We're not even going to be able to get into it all this episode, I think.
No.
So should we move into some news?
Absolutely. I think we should. So let's get into it in Stoking the Fire.
Stoking the Fire.
And welcome to Stoking the Fire, a segment dedicated to letting you know all there is to know about the releases from the Genesys Foundry and the Genesys Role Playing Game. But first, Chris, would you like to tell us about the D20 Radio Podcast of the Week?
I certainly can. Our podcast of the week is, fittingly, as we'll see in a bit, Eberron Renewed. In their most recent episode, number 167, entitled Thinking Inside the Box, Chapter 1, start of a brand new arc, the party is hired by a shady contact to transport a box from one side of the city to the other, under 2 conditions. Don't look in the box, and don't get caught. But when they witness a murder in the streets and must run from the city watch, only one question is on everyone's mind. What's in the box?
Like any typical PC party.
I know. This is a classic RPG campaign problem that has been done so well. And I love how this is being tackled. And I can't wait to see how it's happening.
Yeah.
But, for some actual play Genesys, it doesn't get much better than this. So go check it out. And you can find it and more amazing gaming and geekery podcasts right now at d20radio.com.
It's so good that they've embraced the love of Genesys, and for those who've never played before and want to know more, it is really a great way to learn the system, as several of the players are pretty new to Genesys. If not, this is their first foray into that. So as Chris said, go and check them out, especially if you've only just caught the Genesys bug. Can I even use that turn of phrase in the current environment?
Yeah. So talking about the Foundry, as I leave that right alone, there have been quite a few new releases, since our last episode, especially from Chris the Machine Markham, which we'll get into in a minute. But since our last episode, we've had 12 new releases.
Yeah.
I don't even think we're going to have time to get into all of them, guys, but we are going to do a fair chunk.
Yep.
And the rest we'll get to on our next show. Firstly, though, the best news of all is that Keyforge is out and is available in PDF form right now from Drive-Thru RPG. But not only that, as we promoted on social media, the minute it happened, FFG has also updated the terms and conditions of the Foundry agreement to include Keyforge. Yep. That means that authors on the Foundry can now contribute products to the Foundry that include the Keyforge setting, which is awesome. And we have one author that's already taken advantage of that.
And of course, who was the first to do that?
Chris Markham?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. And speaking of Chris Markham, the first of his slew of products is the first product off the shelf, so to speak, for review. And that is recently released Trades of Terranoth. Realms of Terranoth sourcebook, as much of the work he does is, offers 8 career options for players. But this supplement also provides us with the conversion of Descent board games 32 careers into Genesys, along with some intriguing options for special abilities, and ways to kind of spice up career options in general. Some of those careers include careers with familiars as their focus, which has a soft spot in my heart. 2 new creatures in it as well, the Stone Sentry and the Soul Shadow. And finally, you get a pack of ready-to-print adversary cards for the familiars included with this product, which I think is fantastic. I really do like this product. I especially like that someone else feels that careers need something more than a skill set.
Yep.
The special abilities for each career make it worthwhile and offer another way to make characters feel unique.
Yep.
That alone was worth the price of admission for me. There are a couple layout issues. I think it needs some working on, but it's still totally readable and useful for anyone wanting to use it in their Realms of Terranoth campaign. And quite frankly, pretty much any fantasy campaign. And it's super cheap. $2 right now, or as a part of the Copper Club bundle.
Very, very cool. I do like that. The next one is Traps for Genesys, and that's by Kyle Carty. The blurb simply says, this document contains quick and easy rules for implementing effective and balanced traps for your Genesys adventures. And it's very cheap for only $2.50.
I haven't had the chance to read this one yet, so I'm kind of intrigued to dive into it.
And what's the next one?
Golems, GOLEMS, Genesys Organizations, Legions, and Enterprises Management System. This is from one of our own Patreons himself, Fat Crab, Micah Shalom Kesselman. Golems, the Genesys Organizations, Legions, and Enterprises Management System, enables game masters to simulate the goings-on of factions behind the scenes of their campaigns. If you've ever had trouble figuring out what kind of intrigue those background mega corporations are getting up to while your PCs run around pulling gigs for them, how your royal houses scheme and plot against each other, or the ebb and flow of the gangs roving in your post-apocalyptic streets, then Golems may be exactly what you need. There's the blurb. I know Fat Crab is one of our Patreons, and he put a lot of work into this one. Honestly, it left me wanting for a much less complicated system, but that's me. Yeah. That's me. Appearances to the contrary, I'm not a very crunchy GM or a very crunchy player. If there's complicated or detailed rules involved, that's a bit of a turnoff for me. But having said that, I know a lot of players that dig hard the crunchiest crunch that is ever crunched. They want to break their teeth on a game system, right?
Right.
And if you're into that, you will be into this. I'd love to see some a little more narrative reach to it. In fact, I know Huli, I think you've even reached out to Fat Crab to maybe work on something. Yeah, absolutely. Look, a little while ago, I think if anybody wants to go hunting through the FFG forums for Star Wars, they'll be able to find one that I did for organizations, which sort of followed a similar approach, but I think that it was a little bit less complicated. But when I pointed in towards that, because I was considering, bringing that over to Genesys as well, we're going to work on something together which is going to allow people to use what I've done and put it into Golems as well. So, awesome. That's really cool. That's awesome, guys. But it is worth checking out to see if you're going to get some kick out of it. And honestly, it has a recommended price of $250, but it's pay what you want. Yep. It's a pay what you want item. So and keep in mind with Pay What You Want, you can buy it, guys, for a penny or 0 pennies. And then keep in mind you can always go back and add money to it. So it's like, wow, this is amazing. I got a lot of use out of it. I really want to pay this guy for his work. You can always do that.
Yep.
So that's what's great about Pay What You Want through drive-through. So yeah, seriously, check it out.
It is good. So for our next one, we've got Tariano's Transports, which is again by Chris the Machine Markham. And the blurb for this says, the fabled floating city of Taranor is known all over Manara as the greatest shipyard in the world. Join Captain Eddie Bloodkelp as she guides you through the fine vessels the city builds for both Lorimor and the Albician Royal Navy. I love the way that when he does these products, I love the way that he has another NPC that sort of takes you through. I think that's really, really good, and it gives a little bit more flavor to it.
It's good. I know Zumwalt's done that for his for some of his supplements as well, and I really like that approach.
Yep, absolutely. This supplement provides 8 different commonly encountered ships on the waterways of Manara, each with full color deck plans and an image of how the ship appears on the water, gun placements, and of course Genesys stats. In addition, a rare airship is also detailed in a similar manner, which is absolutely fantastic. And it also has vehicle sheets for each, which is great. In addition, the various ships' weapons available are also detailed, along with ship modifications and attachments. And finally, life at sea is described in full, along with the challenges, diversions, including the rules for Fortuna's Favour, which is a dice game, and 3-card Ante, which is another card game, and some of the dangers of the high sea. This is a great product. I've been wanting to do high seas adventures for I don't know how long. So I've grabbed a hold of this book. It's wonderful, and it's only $3. So go and get that. It's great.
Yar.
Yar. It be great.
Now we switch to a different Chris, in fact, the fabulous Christopher Ruthenbeck, who hits up with By Sword and Spell, which is your Genesys toolkit for making your own fantasy setting, he says. It has everything you need to make your own setting, including 6 new species, 8 new talents, generic crafting rules, 3 new magic implements, rules for making your own magic implements, guidance on making your own setting using just the cool rulebook and the EPG, 3 new adversaries, and guidelines for making your own fantasy adversaries using the EPG. What I love most about this is that it is presented in a device-friendly A5 format. And for you non-Americans, Google it. Or excuse me, for you Americans, Google it. For
Thank you.
For you A5 format for the world outside of the US. Okay. But the bottom line is it's a properly sized format for a mobile device. It means you won't need to pinch, zoom, or scroll while you're reading on your phone or your tablet. Most importantly, I love that Christopher actually reached out to us to let us know that as of version 1.2, this product actually now includes a Creative Commons license so that Foundry authors have explicit permission to use the material contained therein for their own works, which is very nice to see in a Foundry product.
Absolutely.
Available right now, $4.99.
Fantastic. The next one on the slate is Genesys Character Booklet, and it's by one of our patrons, RPG Narco, or also known as Roy Altman. The blurb says, presenting the Genesys Character Booklet. This folio-style character sheet is intended for long-term campaigns with lots and lots of space for recording information. In addition, several important rules references, including healing, status effects, encumbrance, etc., are placed in strategic locations, which will surely speed up the game of any player, new or veteran. And realistically, everything that it says there, that's what you get. And it's really, really well done. He's got the formatting down pat. There's only one small issue, but that's me just nitpicking, so I'm not going to really mention it. See if you can find it, though.
Are you OCD, bud? Are you talking about the crease in the talents?
Yeah, pretty much. But see, I'm OCD.
It's great, Roy. You done good, Roy. and it pay what you want, you did real good.
Yeah, absolutely. But tell you what, with the work that he's put into it, he's got a recommended price of $3, and I think that it's worth it. It's absolutely fantastic, and it fits in that nice sort of. It's basically the equivalent for us Australians. It is going to be if you're printing it on A4 and you fold it in half, it gives you that A5 format, which is great for just popping in your tablet case or whatever it is that you take to your gaming sessions. And really, really handy. And you can print up a new one every so often because it is form fillable as well.
Next up, we have another one from the machine, Chris Markham, Timoran's Tome. Mm-hmm. This massive tome, as he describes it, is a lost spell book of none other than Timoran himself. It features over 330 new spell customizations for the Terranoth setting. Mm-hmm. This includes spells for familiar magic skills, but also runes and verse magic skills, which are unique to Terranoth. As well as new customizations for the psychic magic skill introduced in by Scott Zumwalt in Zenithrix. I can never say it.
Neither could I.
Zenithrix's Guide to Magic. A new spell action, Enchant, is also introduced. So a brand new spell, along with spells under each of the magic actions and skills mentioned in the core rulebook, the Expanded Player's Guide, Realms of Terranoth, and the aforementioned tome by Scott. Many spells are adapted to Genesys from Descent expansions, such as Lost Legends, Shadows of Nerikal, Chains That Rust, the Troll Fens, and more. There's just so much to even go into here. It's huge. A magic skills group listing, a spell index with page numbers for references, various natural animal listings for the transform spell for you druids out there, optional new mechanics, and just a ton more. This is a great product with, as always, as we expect from a Terranoth product from Markham, a metric crap ton of research behind it.
Yep.
This is an extremely useful product, and I will point this out specifically. I wanted to call this out. This is an extremely useful product for any GM running Terranoth in Genesys for a bunch of D&D players who need spells to adapt their gaming experience to Genesys. Okay. Tremendous use there. And it's a huge tome with a very decent price for the sheer amount of content it offers. Yep. It's also a part of the Copper Club, but on its own, it is $6.99. Yep.
Absolutely fantastic product. Our next one, which I was very, very excited to see, is Martian Mayhem, also by Chris Markham. It says, Martian Mayhem is an exciting collection of equipment, vehicles, and creatures used by the Martians on the Crucible, all derived from the Keyforge card game and brought to life for Genesys. Join Flix and Bilp. Is that how it's pronounced, I wonder? Bilp?
I think it's Philix and Bleepip.
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 Let us know, Chris. We want to know. As they describe personal equipment like the Biomatrix Backup and Brainstem Antenna to weapons such as the Red Planet Disintegrator. I love the names of these things. Or devices like the Deep Probe or Jammer Pack. You'll find plenty of fun additions for your Martian character as well as, adversaries. So it's fantastic. It also has new ship weapons for the Flying Saucer and a variant walker. I'm not going to even try to pronounce that.
Yixilks. It's the Yixilks Dominator.
And it's described in detail, as well as 4 creatures used by the Martians that they brought into Genesys from the card game as adversaries. And of course, all are beautifully illustrated and given the full Genesys stats for use in your Keyforge campaign. This was great to see, as I mentioned before, to see this on the Foundry ads, and I'm really glad that it was Chris who made it possible. This is the first Keyforge supplement to make it onto the Foundry. Definitely go and check it out. It is only $3, and it's masterful. Well done.
Yeah, fantastic. Next up is Boost number 2, Modern Magic, from Community Project, which we remember the last time they released Boost number 1. Yep. The Book of Online Sourced Triumphs is a Genesys community project with the goal of creating content that relates to a specific theme. And the theme for this issue is modern magic. Inside, you'll find 1 new archetype species, 6 new talents, 1 new weapon, including 2 new weapon item qualities, 5 new pieces of gear, and 5 new adversaries. So this is the second of the community project's offerings.
Yep.
And I was quite pleased with it. For being this community project offering. The only one complaint I had, I think is worth mentioning, is one of the minions in the book, the minor poltergeist, has this massive stat block. It's like a full column, which is just really unusual for a minion.
Yep.
Rival, maybe. Nemesis, definitely. Minion, typically no.
No.
And then maybe just, but honestly, I'm nitpicking. It's free, so I'm not going to complain. I'm not going to complain. But yeah, it's fun to see the community project continue to do this kind of work, and I'm really intrigued to see what else they can put out. Yep,
absolutely. I did notice that, and that is one thing that I think that some people just try to get too much flavor into minions, and that's not the purpose of minions. If they want to be, if they want to make minions really, really nasty, I go back to my example of ninjas. If you want ninjas, grab a thug and give them just brawl or melee, and give them the adversary skill. It doesn't need much changing beyond that. The minions are supposed to last not very long. So again, to avoid that whole D&D mentality, you really have to, rather than going, I've got this massive stat block that I've got to learn to use, and it's only going to last 5 minutes, I'd much prefer to have that time that I'm going to be spending researching and learning what it is that these particular monsters do. I'd much prefer to throw that into the time that I'm going to be spending weaving the story and getting that in my head of the background of the world or whatever else, rather than having to learn rules. And that's the reason why I love Genesys in the first place. So I agree with you. But yeah. The next one is Secrets of the Crucible Genesys character sheet, and it's form fillable with additional dice pools added, and it's by Scott Zumwalt himself. The blurb for it is quite simple. The Genesys character sheet for the Keyforge setting Secrets of the Crucible, form fillable with dice pool calculations, and it's awesome. That's it. And realistically, it's top notch because it comes from Scott. He knows what he's doing. He's good value in that regard. And I really can't say anything more. So get it if you haven't. It's totally free and worth your while, definitely.
As usual, Scott providing phenomenal free resources to the community, which is greatly appreciated. And
absolutely.
Thankfully, they're worth a crap. They're actually very good. Okay, we have spent so much time about this. We are finally to our last release that we're going to talk about.
Yep.
And this is from Randall Mason, Vile Villains 2. So, while the first Vile Villains supplement introduced 8 evil nasties, there's a lot more evil in Minara. In this new collection of Terranoth villains, 8 new different villains are detailed. Each villain is described, illustrated, and given other information to assist GMs in including them in their campaigns. So honestly, and I think this title needs a little bit of work. I know Chris Markham actually had a lot to do with this product, but I think it needs some polish in terms of writing style and ideation. Basically, I mean, and just, having several peer reviewers is very important. And I think several of the products that we've been seeing pop up here and there may just need a little more playtesting and, quite frankly, just a good proofreader for. It's so important. Find 2 to 3 people who are not related to you to look through your work. People you trust that can tell you if your work needs work. I do it. I know GM Hooley does it.
Yep.
I don't know any freelancers that I know in my gaming career, and certainly none that have worked for FFG prior to the demise of the RPG department, who don't do it. So yeah, it's just a thing. I mean, anyway, this product's price is small. It's only $3, but I would really like to see some updates to it and see where it can go.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's a lot in there for, just from what we've said, I think, to some of the other people who are wanting to get involved in the Foundry or already have product in the Foundry. Nobody's expecting, I don't think, anybody to be a masterful writer with no errors at all. because, even FFG have been known to make mistakes in the past. And no doubt in the future, Edge will do the same thing. It basically needs a little bit more product and a little bit more proofreading in that regard. So you can find these and many more fantastic Genesys Foundry content over at drivethroughrpg.com by simply performing a search using the words Genesys Foundry.
And while you're surfing the web, why not jump over and become a supporter of The Forge by joining our Patreon? For as little as $2 a month, you can access our dedicated Discord server where you can interact with other fellow Genesmiths, while higher tiers provide priority for your game and rules questions, special in-show recognitions, and even a special monthly get-together with either Huli or myself to discuss your Foundry product, your campaign, your games, or anything else your sick, twisted, dark, lovely little heart desires.
You got to draw the line somewhere, though, but I don't know where that line is.
Anyway. I don't.
But no matter what, anything you can spare to show your support is appreciated, and each of your donations help the podcast directly so we can continue providing you with excellent regular Genesys content.
That's right, Gamer Nation. Join the Forge community by becoming a supporter at patreon.com/ForgeGenesys today.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Uli, you ready to once again punch it and rock it off into hyperspeed?
Except, I think you'll find Punch It is a Star Wars RPG pilot-only maneuver, and I'll just shut up now. But it is seriously. I am ready, Chris, and it's time to get into The Furnace.
The Furnace.
And welcome to The Furnace, the segment where we take a deep dive into a topic concerning custom creations using the Genesys Role Playing Game. Now, back in episode 15, we took a very long look, and boy was it long, at the rules for vehicles in the Genesys role-playing game and really got to look under the hood. Then in episode 17, we took a further look at how to run vehicle combat at Genesys and the very long explanation of the encounter zone rules, which will be available soon on the Foundry.
Don't make any promises you can't keep there, Huli.
Well, I deserve that. And I resemble that comment, Chris. Seriously, though, this is one of the reasons why, we're making these shows shorter, right? Right. So with that in mind, tonight we'll be continuing our look at vehicles with two of the three C's, which is critical hits and collisions. The other one is going to be chases, and we'll talk about that at a later stage. But we're going to talk about...
You said we were doing chases this episode.
Well, yeah, look, I know, but I think we need to cover the basics first, and these two things often occur during chases. So,
true. Okay. That's fair. And guys, as we mentioned on our last episode on vehicles, we want to ensure that GMs and players alike can use the vehicle rules with ease. Yep. We want you to gain a better understanding of how these rules work, how to use them best in your game sessions, where the rules fall down in some areas, and how to present them. Also, when you're creating your products for the Foundry.
That's right. Yeah. But Chris, as we do, we've spent a few hours already really digging into the vehicle rules, and we don't really want to have to go and summarize them every single time we do this topic, right?
That would be correct. And to that end, guys, as Huli mentioned before, go back and check out episodes 15 and 17 of this podcast. Revisit them before listening to this episode. We are going to assume you have. So if something isn't making sense, go back. You listen. You re-listen. Do not worry. We wait. Okay, we back.
That never gets old. All right, let's get into this. Now, firstly, critical hits are some of the most exciting and harrowing elements to vehicle combat. So before we get into it, how does a critical hit even happen? Chris?
Well, critical hits come from making an attack roll where you do actual damage to a vehicle, and you roll a number of advantages equal to your weapon's critical rating, or a triumph. Mm-hmm. It also occurs when you have a collision, but we will get to that in a bit. Mm. So, Huli, are there any other things that affect a critical hit?
Yeah, there is quite a few, and that includes the vicious item quality. Now, as we mentioned and were corrected back in episode 17, backed up by the latest Genesys RPG errata, you can affect a critical hit roll with the vicious weapon quality. Now, this is an important correction that we didn't sort of kind of get our head around at the time, but obviously do now. But for every level of rating of vicious, you increase the roll on the critical hit by 10. We'll get into that in a minute, how that occurs. So basically, if you have a savage transdimensional power axe or similar nasty weapon from Keyforge, and yes, you can randomly generate that, that has a breach item quality, a hit against the family sedan is going to do some serious damage.
So just to summarize that, the breach item quality ignores its rating in armor. All right. So to put it another way, breach is to armor as pierce is to soak, right?
Right. Correct. Yep.
And then if you get hit, you have to do damage to the vehicle. And then if you damage it, and then if you roll enough advantages or a triumph, you can then cause a critical hit.
Right. You also don't have, you can't forget the 10-to-1 rule when applying personal scale damage to vehicle. We've spoken about that infinitum in the last 2 episodes. Yeah. But the next thing to remember is if the weapon you're using has that vicious item quality.
Okay, so with that, can we use a God help me, a real example of how that might look?
Sure. So look, if we go back to episode 17 where we ran the first couple of rounds in a vehicle combat, for example, in that, Chris, your vehicle suffered a critical hit and it was nasty.
I'm having PTSD flashbacks about that episode, but I do recall that, yes.
Right. So if the weapons the biker thugs were using had breach 1, and that would have been scary, and your buggy had an armor of 1, which it didn't, but if it did, those 2 things were real, the damage caused would need to be 10 or more. And this is important. You must round the personal scale damage down, not the planetary scale up. This is something that people do a little bit wrong. So in our example, if the buggy had an armor of 1, don't think of it as 10 soak. Instead, if the weapon is personal scale, calculate the damage as normal first and then round that number down. In effect, it is the last calculation that you do before applying any damage to the vehicle. So if the biker's weapons could ignore the armor on the buggy, it would need to do 10 or more damage to have a chance to inflict a critical injury or any damage at all.
So if the weapon did 9 points on a personal scale, there's literally no damage caused at vehicle scale because it's not even breaking that 10-to-1 rule. And therefore, there's no chance of even doing a critical hit.
That's right, yeah. Now, if it did do enough damage to go through the vehicle's armor, did more damage to cause at least 1 point of planetary scale damage, and they rolled a triumph or the advantages that they need to activate the critical rating of the weapon, only then can they inflict a critical hit. So it works exactly the same as it does for personal combat.
Well, you're really talking there is my gosh. I mean, they need to roll 20 points of personal scale damage with their armor of 1.
Right.
Because they'd need 10 points of personal scale to get past the armor of 1. And then another 10 points of personal scale to equate to 1 point of hull trauma.
That's right. Exactly.
Ooh. So, yeah, all said and done, personal scale weapons against vehicles, typically without breach, of course.
Yep.
Bad idea. Very, 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 very bad idea.
Indeed.
Okay.
Indeed.
Now, in our example, though, Hooli, there was no breach. And there was no armor, but you did exceed 10 points of damage, if I recall correctly.
Yep.
And you rolled a triumph, right?
Right. And this meant that we went to, and this is the next part of the process, we then went to table 3.2-19. It's like doing law. It's called the critical hit result chart, and it's on page 230 of the core rulebook. And you roll a D100. Now, for those beginners, if you if this is the first episode that you've ever listened to, and you're really wanting to get into Genesys, but you don't know what all these dice are, that it basically means that we roll 2 10-sided dice. Normally, they're different colors, or the numbers of them have tens and units on them. So one is your tens, and the other is your digits, with 00 being 100. All right. Now that I've explained, racing.
Or you can go get one of those Zaki Hedrons.
Yeah. Yes,
I have one.
Of course
I have
you do.
one where it's a literal 100-sided die. It's just a ball covered in tiny, and you just roll it and wait till it stops, and then argue over which number's directly on top. That's how you use it.
Right, I can avoid that argument, thanks. You then add +10 from any previous critical hits that the vehicle has suffered, and you add an extra +10 if you've rolled more than one triumph, or enough advantages to activate another critical hit. Now that's important because you can only ever receive one critical per hit. That's important when looking at linked. Go and look that up. I'm not going to explain it now. But you also get +10 per rank of vicious, as we explained before, that the item has as part of its item qualities.
And if I'm remembering back to that episode, I think when I rolled shrapnel spray, right?
Yeah, likely one of the worst on that table, I might add.
Tell us about it.
And basically what happens is that once you've rolled that, you just follow the instructions on the entry. Now, we're not going to go through all of them, as we know that all of our listeners can read. But something to note here is that this table works heavily with a sidebar on page 221, also of the core rulebook. If you can call it a sidebar, it's half a page.
Half a page? It's half a freaking page!
Yeah, and what it does is it explains what occurs to each component if some sort of damage occurs to it. And it can affect a whole heap of different things. Again, we're not going to go through that. Take a look at that table. The two of them work hand in hand.
Yeah, and listen, as a GM, you're going to have to make a decision about results that don't affect the vehicle due to the components it has. So for example, if you were to roll defenses damaged, and the vehicle has no defenses to speak of, what do you do?
Look, we had a similar question in our last episode in Under the Hammer. And
on personal scale, yeah.
Yeah, so I think the best thing to do here is just to let the dice fall as they may. And, you just leave it up to the narrative description of what's going on. If there are component hits on the vehicle that don't exist, then describe something narrative to equal something similar. So if you've got, we'll use the example that we've just talked about defenses, where it's going to give you a setback, or maybe something happens that causes a setback to another skill type, or, something like that. Or it can just be describing that the wheel suddenly is gone all wobbly, and maybe a fear check might be required, or something like that, that's really going to add to the narrative. You still treat it as a critical hit for the purpose of calculating any further critical hits later on at the level that it's suggesting. But you really don't have to do anything else. You don't have to do any major damage. This combat is deadly enough as it is. As I said, just ask Chris and what it's like to get shrapnel spray on everyone aboard your vehicle.
I did not like that. I did not like that at all. 'Twas disenjoyable.
I think I've apologized enough for that. So just describe it narratively. So just remember to work on the side of the players to make it really fun and exciting.
Now, Holy, as I'm sitting here looking at the table, I do think it's important to also say I don't think we can talk about the critical hits table without mentioning the severity, can we?
We can very briefly touch base on that. So the severity is the difficulty to repair that particular critical hit. Normally you'll use your mechanics skill. There are other options with athletics, etc. But repairing critical hits is something that realistically can't be done just on the fly unless the GM allows it. For example, if you've got a small snub fighter or something like that, that chances are if you're getting a critical hit on your wing, you're not going to be able to go out and repair it. So use your own common sense.
I've had players argue that they should be able to do that.
Really?
Oh, are you kidding? Of course. He's like, well, I've got a flight suit that gives me 6 minutes of air.
Sure. You have some interesting players.
I just have players.
That is true. That is true. So that pretty much is critical hits in a nutshell. It's very, very simple. Just you've got those rules that you have to apply. That it's mainly from the perspective of personal scale weapons versus vehicles, especially if you're in a chase, which we'll get on to a later episode, when you're starting shooting at vehicles with handguns and things like that.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Okay, so this leads us in, Hooli, into, now that we understand how crits work, they are a natural component of the next thing we really do want to talk about this episode, which is collisions. What about collisions, Hooli? Because everyone's favorite thing to do in vehicles.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes and no, depending on how you're doing it. Look, I had to do a little bit of research in regards to this, and I'll explain why. So collisions are covered on page 222 of the Genesys core rulebook, and there really are only two types of collisions. They're not noted in the rules, but this is just what I call them: forced, better known as ramming, and accidental. Both of them follow the same principle. The vehicles involved take either a minor or a major collision and suffer a critical hit no matter what damage occurs as a result. Now, on this, my best guess is it suffers damage equal to the silhouette of the vehicle, less the vehicle's armor rating. Now, this is based on the Trimere that we see in the EPG, which causes 8 damage with its ram attack. And it does have a silhouette of 4. So something specifically designed for that type of thing should cause more damage than something that doesn't. And I felt that double the damage was about right. But again, it doesn't. That's more of a house rule. It's not something which is specified. All that it specifies is that if there is a collision, they automatically suffer a critical hit.
Yeah, I mean, the trireme surprised me because obviously it has that ram attack specifically designed for it. Up until then, at least in Genesys, I had never run damage for collisions, just crits.
Yep.
So, okay, you mentioned minor and major collisions earlier. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, so it talks about it a lot in the book. The minor collision, it's basically just a glancing blow. So, like a side swipe or something like that. While a major collision is a full-on head-on collision. Now, unfortunately, there are no rules for determining which is which unless we turn back to Star Wars.
Yeah, in Star Wars, there's an entire table for spending threat and despair in vehicle combat. And in that, a fail check with despair is a major collision, while a successful check with despair is a minor collision. So what it boils down to is that you can use that tried and true formula that was tested out in Star Wars as a great barometer, or you can use the dice results.
Yep.
And honestly, that comes down to the narrative. And I don't fault Genesys Hooli for not dictating to such a hard degree when you do a major collision or when you do a minor. Because it's narrative. If I'm racing a streetcar alongside somebody and we're shooting at each other and we're plowing down the road and I swerve my car into them to try and knock them into a wall and the two cars are scraping against each other, that's minor collision, right?
Yeah.
Major collision is I am ramming you. You know what I mean? I mean, and those are the two barometers. Yeah.
Look, I'm pretty happy with the way that Star Wars has done it, but obviously, the Genesys has taken the more general approach because we do have things. It has to range all the way from a horse-drawn cart all the way up to the latest advanced TIE fighter. So it really needs to it had to be more generic. Which, Star Wars didn't need to be because most things fly. And there was a defined space battles that is part of the whole, Star Wars trope, I guess. So, I think you can just use, if you've got a buttload of threats or if you've got despairs, just start looking at collisions to be part of the result. Now, as we can see from the previous episode, as well as what we've talked about already when it comes to critical hits, remember that critical hits are nasty. And when it comes to vehicles, PCs have to repair them too. Now, there's not a lot of rules under Genesys for that, but it does cost money for the PCs to go and repair stuff. With Star Wars, it was like 500 credits or something like that for each hull point. And if you've got a vehicle that's got 30-odd hull points, that's a lot of change.
It's a lot. Now, obviously, the severity of the critical you're going to receive when you have a collision, I'm assuming it's going to be a lot worse for a major than a minor.
Yeah, it is. Now, I'll explain that. So basically, in a minor collision, you reduce the critical hit roll on the table by 10 times the vehicle's defense. So if you've got a vehicle that has, like, I don't know, a magnetized hull or something like that, that gives it a defense of 2, it reduces the critical hit roll by 20. Similarly, a major collision follows that same principle, but the multiplier is only 5, not 10. In both circumstances, though, if the result results in the critical hit becoming a result of less than 0, it's cancelled out completely. The vehicle does not suffer that critical hit. The other thing to remember here is the speed of the vehicle. Now, speed affects the size of a critical hit. So make sure that you're checking out table 3.2-14, vehicle speeds in structured encounters, where at speed 3 to 4, you're going to be adding plus 20 to any critical hits. And at speed 5, it's plus 40. So at speed 5, and if you hit something, prepare to be a bug on a windshield. Because you're going straight to the top of that chart, or the bottom of the chart almost.
Yes. And the way I like to think about this is I often use the example of talking about both aspects. Minor versus major critical hits by vehicle type and how important defense is, okay? And then speed. I think about a bicycle. All right? So if you stat out a bicycle in Genesys, that is a vehicle with 0 defense,
right?
Okay? Earlier, we talked about the example of cars glancing alongside each other in a chase. That's a minor collision.
Yep.
If a car glanced against a bicycle, that is also technically a minor collision.
Right.
However, a bicycle, unlike a car, is not going to have defense.
Right.
Therefore, there will be no critical hit reduction.
Yep.
Meaning that a sideswipe from a car, even though it's a minor, or even from a bike for that matter, if 2 bikes plow into each other, that can be disastrously catastrophic for both vehicles, okay? even if it's a minor collision or a sideswipe. I mean, you're not going to get any crit reduction. It can get hairy and really bad, all right? And then, of course, speed is also obvious, okay? If you're riding down the sidewalk on training wheels, okay, and you have a minor critical hit, it's not going to be bolstered by your speed any. If I'm going down the side of a mountain on a bicycle and I crash out, I'm going to get some pluses to the critical hit. It's like very basic, common sense stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
But I'd really like to get back to, you mentioned earlier, forced versus accidental collisions, which obviously are not book terms. They're your terms, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But what is the difference there? What does that mean in the context of this discussion?
Well, look, the accidental is there is absolutely no intention to ram or damage the opposing vehicle or object at all. This one's a lot easier, and it occurs, as we explained just before. It's either a major or a minor collision, depending on the narrative. One thing that I did want to mention very quickly is when it comes to vehicle speed, something that you may consider as well, depending on the narrative and depending on how they're colliding. And I don't like to bring any sort of physics into these games at all, but if 2 vehicles are going at full speed towards each other and they are colliding, technically speaking, it's both of their speeds combined. So if you've got two vehicles speeding at speed 5, or to put it into real terms, if they're speeding at 50 k's an hour, the collision is actually occurring at 100 k's an hour. Kilometers for those who are outside of the US. I don't know the the translation into miles, Chris, but you might be able to help
miles
me out.
per hour.
Miles per hour, yeah.
Yeah.
So you're multiplying the speeds. So something that you might want to consider, depending on the narrative, is that if you've got two vehicles that you can't obviously go past speed 5, but if you've got two vehicles traveling at speed 2 and they collide with each other head on for whatever reason, maybe there's multiple drives, you might want to consider the upgrading that damage to what it would be at speed 5. But that's a side note.
And that's obviously a house rule.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, not rules as written, but a good suggestion for those unusual circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I said, accidental, no intention to run into anything. The forced, however, is a little bit different, and that's basically where there is an intention to ram the opposing vehicle or object. If you're into street racing or whatever else, and you're part of a street gang undercover cop or something like that. Not that I'm going to go down Fast and Furious at all. But if you had to do you had to run your vehicle into a shop to steal electrical parts or whatever else, a ram raid, we would call it in Australia. I don't know what you guys call it over there. But that is something that is intentional, and that's where these rules come in. Again, there is no rules for this in the core rulebook. So again, we have to look towards Star Wars. And this was really, really obscure and hard to find. I had to ask a couple of people because there are a lot of books which means tons of pages, and none of it is in electronic format. So you can't just go find this. So you've actually got to go through it manually. But there is an obscure reference. It's a sidebar, and it's really small on page 65 of Stay on Target, which is the career book for aces. And basically it says that an action is needed, and the difficulty works exactly the same as Gain the Advantage, which is awesome because Gain the Advantage is still in Genesys. Now, there could be some argument that, to even collide with something doesn't need to be speed 4. No. What it's talking about here is the difficulty is calculated in the same way as you do for Gain the Advantage.
It's not saying you have to perform the Gain the Advantage actual maneuver.
Correct.
It's saying specifically, it's just, it uses that same difficulty formula calculation in Star Wars.
Yep.
And this comes down to also with forced collisions, Huli, like, I don't even know if you should even put a speed limit on, a minimum, because like the first vehicle to even hint at the ability to have forced collisions is obviously the trireme from the expanded player's guide, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And it has a max speed of 2 because it's a trireme.
Exactly. So yeah, that's don't even look at the speed limitation for Gain the Advantage. You might also want to consider creating talents, perhaps for ship captains to add setback or upgrade the difficulty of ramming checks if you're talking about capital ships, or things like sailing vessels and things like that. There may be another opportunity in there for a tier 1 talent that may be ranked to increase the critical hit roll by 5 per rank. If you're, if you were to call it something like, I'm taking you with me or something like that.
I'd make it 10 per rank.
So, that's plus 50 though, Chris. That's a lot of points. When you start looking at it, if you're willing to pump,
that much XP into 5 talents,
that's true. That is true.
And get all the way to tier 5, you deserve it. Sorry,
yeah, true. No, that's fair. That's fair. And you've also got some rules in the EPG, which talk about as Chris mentioned, as I mentioned before, the Tremere. as well as there's some rules in there from the buggy that were used in our example combat. Now, the other thing to remember is the vehicle also needs to make it into engaged range with its target. And the best way to do that is through the reposition maneuver. So, but you can do it, according to Sam Stewart, you can do it using your forced movement. So that's pretty important too. So it has to be engaged. It works exactly the same as Gain the Advantage, which is cool. And, speed is also going to play a factor as normal. And you might want to consider adding the speeds, as I mentioned before. And don't forget silhouettes as well. That can play a big part, because obviously if you're in a small stub fighter and you're trying to ram the side of a battleship, it's probably going to be just that little bit easier than it is to, do the opposite, I guess. So, and if that is successful, your vehicle takes a minor collision while the other vehicle takes a major collision. But if you fail, you both take major collisions.
Yep.
So that's pretty much it. Because obviously the reason why you're taking a minor collision, if you're successful, is that you're never going to intentionally just destroy yourself. They've taken that into consideration. But these things aren't easy because you've got all of these upgrades and whatever else, because you're not going to be doing this at speed 1. Some things from the creative side of things is that if that sort of thing is going to be an important part of your story, if you're doing a Pirates of the Caribbean type thing where there is a lot of these, ramming attacks or things like that you might want to consider creating talents for your ship's captains to add setback or auto upgrade the difficulty of ramming checks. So,
you got all this coming in, right? All these factors taking place, right? But and so if we follow the Star Wars system recommendation, okay, and you make that check with a difficulty determined similar to how it is with Gain the Advantage using that same formulae. What happens if you're successful? What happens if you fail?
Well, if you're successful, and this is the same with, this basically comes down to if it's successful, both vehicles take a collision. Now, this is where it's a little bit different. The one it says in Stay on Target is it says that if the character succeeds, they resolve a collision against the target as outlined in the collision sidebar on page 256 of Age of Rebellion, which basically all that it's saying is that you take a minor collision if you basically didn't mean it, while other vehicles, the other vehicle that you're colliding with takes a major collision. If you fail, though, you both take a major collision. So that's something to consider as well.
So once you commit to this action, a collision is going to happen.
Yep.
Okay.
Correct.
When you've made the maneuver to engage, it's going to happen. If you're successful, you suffer a minor collision. They suffer a major collision. If you are unsuccessful, if you fail the check, you both suffer major collisions.
Correct.
With silhouette and speed being a full part of that.
And yeah. It's very bad.
So if you're going to use this forced rule brought in from Star Wars, I also have another suggestion that I would make based on my many years of running this in Star Wars.
Right.
If the vehicle has defense, in certain circumstances,
yes,
you may want to allow that to affect the roll. Now, it's the problem is that defense, as you mentioned before, is also calculated as a part of the collision result, right? So you may or may not want to do that. It depends on what type of defense it is. I'll be perfectly honest. I would really only do it for space opera or sci-fi games because their defense comes down to stuff like energy shielding, which can literally glance things off. If you're not dealing with that, I really wouldn't do it. But I don't know. It's just one other takeaway that I've seen a lot of house ruling being added in for very common reasons to make forced critical hits or forced collisions a lot more impactful in spaceship combat.
And really, that's the first time that we see anything in Genesys like that. The first time that I recall seeing anything similar to that was when they started talking about the Hammerhead vehicle that they used in Rogue One. But that also appears earlier on in another book as well. So these are things that that it's basically saying that it reduces the amount of damage that it needs to, or reduces the critical, because it's designed to collide with something. That's its purpose. So if it's hitting, it's going to reduce, but the other party, because it's designed for that purpose, is going to take extra damage as well. And that's how the Trireme does as well. So yeah. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell for the forced side of things. So yeah. So hopefully that's given you a really good idea as to how to look at collisions and how to look at critical injuries and how they operate. And I know that there is a fantastic supplement, which is by Joshua, I can't remember his last name.
Josh Taylor,
thank you, that has done one which talks about critical injuries and critical hits, and it's absolutely fantastic. So go and have a bit of a hunt for that on the Foundry as well. So yeah, so that's pretty much it, Chris.
Good discussion. I think we've teed things nicely up now that we have all these dominoes in place to get to chases when we return to vehicles next time.
Absolutely.
So, it's very, very, very good. Well, Holy, I think it is now time that we head into something new and something quite exciting.
Indeed. I can't wait for this, as it's been, a long time coming. We've been talking about it for a while. But more importantly, I think it's really going to be a benefit to many GMs out there, for sure.
I couldn't agree more. I'm kind of sad because you weren't able to make it for the inaugural conversation of this segment.
I was not, unfortunately, but when you're trying to organise everyone, it's important to stick to those deadlines. So you were gracious enough to interview Eric in relation to that. So yes,
yeah. And it was a fun conversation, and I can't wait to enter this new section of the Forge because the anvil is nice and warm.
I think we should too, because it's time for our very first segment of Eberron Reforged.
Eberron Reforged.
Genesys is an amazing system, and fans and players the world over are taking this incredible building block narrative dice framework and applying it to many genres and existing settings. And here at The Forge, we are all about giving you the tools you need to bring your favorite settings to the table with this system. But while that often means original content, that's not always the case. In fact, for truly dedicated fans of existing settings, finding a way to bring those settings into the Genesys system is a labor of love that can breathe new life and new gaming experiences into what seems like familiar territory. And to that end, we are proud to welcome for his very first appearance on the show, Eric Strimple, or DM Eric, one of the brains behind the Geek Pantheon and Knowledge Check podcasts, but perhaps most notably to our listeners as the GM and producer of D20 Radio's own actual play podcast, Eberron Renewed. For over 3 years, and at the time of this recording, Eric, 165 episodes? Eberron Renewed has been a gem of an actual play podcast that began by role-playing D&D 5th edition in the fan-loved Eberron campaign setting, a fantasy steampunk high magic romp created by the legendary Keith Baker. Eric, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Chris. I'm excited.
Oh, we're excited too, man. So, dude, listen, Eberron Renewed has always been a great pleasure to listen to for many of us, but Genesys fans should take a strong note to listen now, because after the conclusion of your first 3-year Eberron campaign in 5th edition D&D, the Eberron Renewed crew decided, starting with, episode 161, I think?
I believe so, yeah.
to launch an entirely new Eberron campaign, but not with the Dungeons and Dragons system. You guys are now using Genesys. And listeners, as you can imagine, this required a tremendous amount of planning and design from Eric and the rest of the cast in order to make this massive port possible. Which brings us all to tonight and the inauguration of a brand new segment for the Forge podcast, Eberron Reforged. In this recurring segment, we're going to be diving deep into this Genesys conversion with Eric. We're going to take a look at the choices that Eberron Renewed has made in terms of creating species, careers, talents, skills, magic, and much, much, much more. And so, to that end, Eric, I really want to dive into this. And before we get started on tonight's, segment of Eberron Reforged, dude, tell us about the show. And why you all decided to switch from the world's most popular RPG system to one of our favorites, Genesys.
Well, it was solely a business decision. We thought appealing to a smaller audience would be the right way to go. I'm of course kidding. No, for your listeners who didn't listen to the first campaign of Eberron Renewed, it, like many D&D campaigns, once you get past the 8th level, you're dealing with demigods at best in terms of your PCs and their power level. And that's a feature of the D&D system. But we wanted to, and I was kind of driving the desire to tell a different kind of story. I wanted to tell a much more low level feel throughout the campaign. And the best way I kind of pitched it to my players and then explained to our listeners is campaign 1 was the Avengers. And we want campaign 2 to be the Defenders.
Nice.
Yeah. And without hacking the system apart, there's not a great way to tell a really kind of low power D&D campaign all the way through if you have any kind of magic involved, because you just get so powerful. So we were really trying to avoid the D&D power creep and the PCs beginning to feel larger than life. We wanted to tell a much more human story. And then also, kind of selfishly, D&D, when we first started this campaign, D&D hadn't touched Eberron yet in 5th edition. And so that afforded us a lot of freedom to say, well, yeah, it worked this way in 3.5, it worked this way in 4th edition, but we don't have any reference point for 5th edition, so we're going to do it this way. And there's not anything anybody can say about it. And now D&D 5th edition has started producing Eberron content, and we don't want to be handcuffed to WotC's interpretation of Warforged and the Kalishtar and Shifters. And so going to a different system afforded us a lot more freedom, both in the way Genesys functions as a system, but then also our ability to homebrew things without listeners going, well, why aren't you just using the Artificer class that WotC provided and not having to respond, we don't like it. So those were all the different wheels turning in my head as the end of the first campaign was on the horizon, and I started thinking about the future for the show. And you and I actually had a long conversation one night about that decision and kind of just having fatigue. I mean, we'd been playing the same system for 3 years. This is my only game that I get to play because on top of running the game, I also produce the show. And so I don't have time for a lot of other home games. And so this game is the system that I get to play in. And I was ready to run in a different system. So that's why we decided to switch from the world's most popular RPG.
Okay, so then that begs the question, why Genesys? And what made it the appealing choice? Because, I mean, I know I ran Star Wars for your group in a massive 12-hour session that actually got released into a series of episodes last summer on the Order 66 podcast, one of the other shows I co-host. And obviously that's very similar to system to Genesys in most respects. And I know just recently I got the chance to run a Genesys game for you guys, a one-shot in Dusters and Dragons that was released as a special series of episodes on your podcast. But I mean, outside of that, I mean, that's the experience you guys have had for the most part. What made you decide to move to this system?
Yeah, it's a simple situation, kind of like what I alluded to, that it's the system that at least me and Philip, who have the most experience in our group with Genesys, wanted to play. We both had kind of discussed the fact, especially when Genesys first launched, about how cool it would be to try and put something together for Eberron out of Genesys. But there were a lot of holes in that plan. And we're like, well, I mean, there'd be so much work to do. And then Terranoth came out and was like, well, now there's a lot less work to do. And then Shadow of the Beanstalk came out. It's like, well, now we're getting even closer to just being able to mash all of this stuff together. And fortunately, Keyforge has been kind of the final puzzle piece for a virtually fully realized Eberron in Genesys. All the tools are there. Like, because the obvious other candidates would be like Savage Worlds, because a lot of people play Eberron using the Savage World system.
Oh, yeah.
And obviously Fate is a great system. And there's all sorts of systems out there. But for a pulpy, high action, yet relatively low power type of story, Genesys just, it has the flexibility to fit the bill. And we wanted a system that could support Eberron if for some reason the players grow sick of being locked into the lower levels of Sharn, which is where we're currently set, and they want to leave the city and go explore Ondare or the Eldine Reaches or Valinar. We need a system with the adaptability and the flexibility to handle both a gritty urban style campaign and a high fantasy courtly drama. And Genesys has that capacity. A lot of systems do, but also Genesys is the system that I'm familiar with. I played Savage World once. I played Fate a couple of times. The two systems that I'm most comfortable running would be D&D and Genesys, and by virtue of that, Star Wars.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm very excited, and as those of us who've been listening to these first few episodes and really seeing the interpretation as you guys are really, in some cases, for some of your players, really learning the system and diving into it for the first time. And so all of that leads us to this series, and honestly, the preparation and the how many hours of writing and preparation did you and the others do to create this conversion for Eberron?
So the conversations first started between me and Philip probably this time last year is when it was finally like, okay, we're going to do this. And not to knock Jeff, Trevor, or Randy, but they have at best minimal experience with Genesys. And so they just wouldn't have the skill set to have a hand in the adaptation process. And so Philip helped in the early stages quite a bit. And then I just kind of hit a point where I was like, I'm going to put my head down and really start slogging away. But what I did, and what I would recommend anybody doing if you're looking at doing this kind of adaptation for Genesys, I started doing like stuff like the skill list and talents and things that were going to be needed regardless of player choices. But then I started waiting until I started hearing from my players about what they wanted to play. So the first one out of the gate was Philip wanting to do a Hobgoblin Artificer. And so it was like, okay, I need to look at the Hobgoblin archetype and I need to start working on Artificer. And by virtue of that, Artifice magic. And then Jeff said, I think a Goliath Monk would be cool to play. And so I started working on Goliath and Monk talents. So there are still plenty of gaps in Eberron with my personal conversion, like a codified version of Dragon Marks. We don't have that yet, even though it's one of the most iconic parts of Eberron, because none of my players wanted it. So I was able to kind of punt that down the field and be like, I'll get to that later. So yeah, I very much listened to what the players wanted and started building from there because I knew that's what I needed to have. But at this point, I do have quite a few more archetypes. Let's see, I have a dozen archetypes built now, like 60 pages of worth of talents in a Word document, a good amount of careers. So I continued building, even though the campaign doesn't need it, just to kind of continue to fully build that out in case somebody dies and we need to build a new character. So I want to have some options ready for them.
Well, okay, you mentioned something which is really the topic we'd like to start with tonight for this inaugural episode, because when we talk about either whether it's building your own setting from whole cloth or whether it's doing a conversion of an existing intellectual property, as you've done with Eberron, when you're laying those first foundational steps, it really starts and ends with skills.
Yeah.
I mean, skills inform everything. It's from species, that you're going to create, and archetypes, to career creation, obviously, to also talents, because talents are informed by skills, to equipment, to magic, to everything.
Yeah. Yeah, I knew that was step one of the process was sitting down and figuring out, okay, obviously for a fantasy setting like Eberron, Terranoth is a good place to start. But that was also one of the first questions we got from a listener is, did you just pull the skill list whole cloth? And you can't do that because Terranoth has a lot of stuff that Eberron doesn't and vice versa. But my mentality, and there's a great bit of advice from a YouTube channel called WebDM. They're a D&D dedicated channel, but their quote that I love is, the stuff in the player's handbook is what is available to the players, not everything that exists in the world.
Right.
And I think a lot of people get hung up on that idea. So for me, skill list is how, as a GM, or if you're creating something for the Foundry and you're creating a setting, you communicate to the players, here are the important things for heroes in this world to know. Most fantasy settings, farming is one of the most important skills a person could have in that setting. You don't see it on a PC skill list because you don't need to make that check as a PC. And so I really wanted to communicate. That's why if we were doing another high fantasy style campaign like campaign 1, probably wouldn't have had knowledge underworld. And we'll get into the exact knowledge skills and all the skills that I put in there. But that's one that was definitely like, okay, this has to be in here because of the type of campaign I'm wanting to do. That was my mentality, is really communicating to the players. These are the things that a hero would need for this story that I'm trying to tell.
Okay, so let's then talk about the skills that you ended up with. And to have a meaningful conversation here, let's just lay it out. And maybe you can tell us by skill type what skills you ended up with on the final skill list.
Yeah. For social skills, it's the fabulous 5: charm, coercion, deception, leadership, negotiation. No need to reinvent the wheel there. They did a great job of picking what social skills were going to be needed. For general skills, we went with alchemy, athletics, cool, coordination, discipline, mechanics, medicine, operating, perception, piloting, resilience, riding, skullduggery, stealth, streetwise, survival, and vigilance. And then for the knowledge skills, adventuring, nature, lore, society, and underworld.
Oh, you went with 5.
Yep.
Cool. Well, can't wait to talk about that. Okay.
Combat skills, we went with melee light and melee heavy, ranged and brawl, your classic fantasy. And then for magic skills, arcana, artifice, divine, primal, and verse.
Interesting. So we have the creation of a new and, quite frankly, fitting for those who know the setting, magic skill, but we'll come to that.
Oh boy.
So okay, let's talk through. So some of these, I don't want to belabor every one of these because some of these make just way too much sense.
Yeah.
But I do want to talk through, the skill choices by type, what you chose to include, but also what you chose to omit, and why, as well as, very importantly, take a look at some of the new skills you created for this setting and why. I guess we could probably start with social skills, since you did, as you said, there wasn't much to change there. And typically for most settings, there wouldn't be.
Yeah, I mean, it's with social skills. It really once again comes down to how are you communicating to your players. If this was going to be a social first campaign, then I might have tried to break some stuff down a bit more. A big thing is I think 3 of my PCs perform with some kind of instrument. And a big question early on was, well, how do we do performance checks? And my response to them was, well, what is the intention of your performance? Like, are you trying to charm people? Are you trying to rally troops? I mean, it's all still covered in social skills. But if it was a really important thing for them to have some sort of performance skill, then it might have warranted creating something. But when push came to shove, I feel like Genesys does a really good job of, you can just ask that question regardless of what somebody's doing. What is the intention behind the action? That is the skill that you need to use with a social environment.
Well said. Very well said. Okay, so then we move into general skills. Now, you immediately eschewed some of the things that are obviously completely off tone for the setting. So I don't know if much explanation is needed, but we're not going to find astrocartography.
Yeah.
We're not going to find computers, right?
Yeah.
We're not going to find driving. Although you did keep operating and piloting, but we'll talk about that. Mm-hmm. But in terms of the general skills, though, I mean, what's important here for Eberron? Because I think some of the things that often get, moved out of the way for a fantasy setting you really did have to consider here, especially talking about mechanics, skullduggery, piloting and riding. I mean, like...
Yeah. So for your listeners that aren't familiar with Eberron, Eberron is what if magic replaced technology and fueled technology. And so an important thing with a skill like mechanics that I made clear to Philip for his character is like, mechanics isn't just nuts and bolts in Eberron. Because magic infuses this whole world, mechanics is also fixing magical things, like working with arcane items. And Trevor is playing your classic elf scoundrel. And I told him skullduggery covers arcane locks because it just wouldn't make sense for somebody who was good at lockpicking to not be prepared to deal with magical locks in a world that everybody locks their door with a magical lock practically.
Right.
And so I think that's a wrinkle with settings that have magic everywhere, is looking at your general skills outside of the magic skills and saying, okay, well, what would it be reasonable that somebody piloting a magically infused ship, piloting would still cover that. It's not only your typical flying ship with wind sails or whatever. And so that was an important thing for me to communicate to my players, is for a setting like Eberron, magic doesn't only exist in the magic skills. And for things like piloting and riding, there was conversations around keeping driving in there because it's an urban setting. And there's things called sky coaches in Eberron that are like small ships that people drive around, like in episode 2, Attack of the Clones, the Coruscant scene, the car chase. That's what it looks like between the Towers of Sharn, except with like wooden boats flying around everywhere.
Right.
And so it was like, well, my mentality has always been, if there are 3 dimensions of movement, then it's piloting. Like if you have to worry about what's above and below you, then you're piloting a thing. You're no longer driving a thing. So that's why I eliminated driving and kept piloting in the Eberron flavor. And then if it's like a stagecoach or something with any kind of animal interaction, then it would fall to riding. So,
and that's pretty common for most fantasy settings, I would think, in terms of riding. What's interesting is, operating is also a very common skill in fantasy settings, but that's because of we're even your most rudimentary fantasy setting has sailing ships. You know what I mean, and that's the skill used to operate them. I'd love to talk about the distinction for you between operating and piloting, because we've discussed this. We actually discussed this at length on this very show. So, I mean, from your perspective, how does that line out in Eberron?
So Eberron has a lot of wonderful things that are much bigger than a fantasy setting would typically allow because of the infused nature of magic. And like you said, operating is typically used for sailing ships, but Eberron has airships that fly throughout the air that require large crews. And they've also introduced, like in 5th edition, some larger than life land vehicles as well, that it wouldn't be reasonable for a single person to be behind the wheel driving the thing. It requires coordinating multiple people to facilitate this thing actually moving. So that's why operating was kept in there, is because while in our first campaign, just by virtue of necessity, the airship didn't have a full crew on it. They were going bare bones. In this campaign, because they're less powerful, if they need an airship and they try to commandeer an airship, it's going to be an operating check to get people on board and coordinated to actually get this thing going. So that's why that one was kept in, and where it would come into play as opposed to just a straight up piloting check. So yeah,
interesting insight. Okay, and I totally see where you're coming from with it. I would have done the same thing. Okay, let's talk about what is sure to be the most contentious aspect of skill conversion for Eberron, and that is the knowledge skills. Now, on this podcast, we've always said, when you're doing knowledge skills, you want to shoot for 4, maybe 5. That's okay, but we often talk about how it's incredibly important to find out, to think about. You made a point earlier, that excellent advice from WebDM, that what's available to the players is not everything that exists in the world, that there are tons of areas of knowledge that it's not it's not fitting for a PC to take ranks in because it doesn't have a meaningful impact on the story.
Mm-hmm.
What you've done here, and I'm as big an Eberron junkie as you, and I know the world quite well. Some might be surprised by your selections. So can you talk about each of these? Yeah.
So once again, for people that tuned out when I was just reading a long list of words, adventuring, nature, lore, society, and underworld are the 5 that I went with. And I feel like for especially any kind of pulpy setting, adventuring is a skill that has so much utility and can serve well in so many situations that I wanted to keep it included. And also it is the skill that the artifice magic skill pings off of for those effects that are X amount of ranks in knowledge skill. And then nature, I kicked around nature versus geography, but given the nature of the campaign and the lack of travel that I anticipated happening, geography from just a semantic point didn't make sense because they're not going to need to know the lay of the land and how to get from point A to point B. Mm-hmm. But nature, encountering natural things, fungus growing somewhere in the base of the towers of Sharn or a type of rock or something made a lot more sense, and a skill that they might need to actually employ at certain points in the campaign. And then lore is obviously covering your history, religion, all like that long list of knowledge skills that like D&D and Pathfinder have. That's basically just the lore of the world. So lumping those all together made sense, just to prevent the spreading out too much of XP. I didn't want to break it down too much for them. And then society and underworld were kind of 2 sides of the same coin, but I wanted there to be a distinction between the upper levels of Sharn and the lower levels, because you're going to know different things based on where you're from, based on the type of people that you interact with. And it's great for our party because we have one character whose background existed in the upper echelons of Sharn, and one character who has pretty much always existed since they've come to Sharn in the underworld. So having that dichotomy of knowledge was really important, because you could have just had society and used it for checks with gangsters and stuff like that. But I felt like, especially given the background of my various PCs, allowing that distinction for their sake was really important.
Now, one of the things that I can hear listeners crying out when they hear this is, as you point out, Eberron is a high magic setting. Mm-hmm. Or, I mean, if you want to get technical, it's really a low magic setting. It's just pervasive magic.
Widespread
right?
Low magic, I think it's how Baker
it's how bigger. Widespread low magic. So how do you handle generalized knowledge of, you may have already answered this in a roundabout way, but how do you handle a knowledge skill for a generalized understanding of magic and magical effects, which is a very common skill we see in other fantasy settings?
Yeah, it once again comes down to the essence of the magic is how I handle it in my game. So if it's understanding some runic carvings in a wall or in even an arcane lock, it's probably going to come down to lore. But if it's an arcane trap, I would gladly accept an adventuring check, because an adventurer would probably know something about arcane traps. And then more primal magic, like druidic circles, things like that, nature check totally works. I think kind of what we said, it's widespread low magic, which means the magic doesn't exist in a single arcane skill. It spreads out over every part of life in Eberron, and therefore every type of knowledge in Eberron. So that's how I intend to handle it. Is Arcana checks don't exist. If it's something that deals more with society, like I want to check out this thing that amplifies sound that is in this person's house, and it's like just a music speaker or something like that, it might be a society check, because those are the situations where you interact with those kinds of things. So once again, keeping it open for what's the motivation behind the magic informs what knowledge skill would be attached to it.
So that's a fascinating way to think about it. And it really builds on the generalized understanding of the world. So I was eager to get to talk about that. Well, very cool. Okay, so then we have combat skills, and you had said melee light, melee heavy, ranged, and brawl. Okay?
Yep.
So brawl totally makes sense. Talk to me about the decision to break up melee and keep ranged as a single skill. And that's pretty common to fantasy settings, but is, talk about that.
And I listened to the advice that came off of this very show in one of your early episodes that was don't split both and don't keep both singular, because it's a balancing thing. And when it came down to it, because obviously there are plenty of ranged weapons that it makes sense would require a lot more strength to utilize, or they're a lot more unwieldy. But it just seemed a bit too pedantic to say, well, a heavy crossbow is going to require ranged heavy and a short bow is going to require ranged light. It's just ranged. And but with melee, even in as pervasive a magic setting as Eberron is, you still have rapiers and daggers versus great axes and war hammers.
Right.
And so I just kind of like with the social skills, no need to reinvent the wheel. And we weren't going to, a lot of people, when Jeff decided he was going to be a monk, not just you, I had a conversation with you where you said it, but also our listeners, the ones who play Genesys are all huge fans of Keith Cappell's Ready Fight. And they were all like, oh, you have to go use that for Jeff's monk. And it was just like, but then I have to have that be just in the skill list if I'm going to break down Brawl that much. And so I didn't go with that. I stole plenty of talents from it. Thank you, Keith. But I decided to keep Brawl a single skill and Range a single skill just because there wasn't enough distinction in the items available to the players to justify forcing the players to spread out their XP that much.
Fair enough. So talk to me about the lack of gunnery. Eberron is a setting where you've got operating as an obvious skill, and airships and high seas and high skies, piracy are a real thing.
Yep.
So how are you handling shipborne combat?
So I decided ultimately to take the stance of given the nature of the campaign and what I had laid out to my players in session 0, rather, none of them were going to take gunnery, even if it was on the skill list, because none of them are going to anticipate needing that, because I've told them it's an urban campaign. We're not going to be traipsing around the entirety of Corvair on an airship. And also, I really feel like the distinction in like a sci-fi setting or Star Wars, the difference between using a rifle and using a giant machine gun on the back of a ship, there's a greater separation of skill there than a crossbow and a really big crossbow mounted to the side of a ship, if that makes sense. And that's primarily what you're going to be dealing with, even in Eberron, when it comes to ship combat, is just a bigger thing. So point and shoot, use your range skill.
Gotcha.
It's not the most fun answer, but that's the answer I got.
Well, no, it all makes good sense. But what I think is really important for a takeaway here is it comes down to what the party is actually going to be using.
Yeah.
And we've said similar things on this show before, but it's wonderful to see this in practice for a real conversion that's going to inform hopefully hundreds of episodes to come of an actual play podcast. That everything you did was you mentioned to begin with was tailored to what your goals were for the campaign.
Yeah.
So that's key. Now, speaking of that, leads us to the last area of skills to really talk about, and what will surely, no doubt, be the second most contentious aspect of this entire endeavor, and that is magic skills. Now, you had said Arcana, Artifice, Divine, Primal, and Verse.
Yes.
Talk to me about this, and maybe let's talk about Artifice last, because that was something you created new out of whole cloth. But talk to me about Arcane, Divine, Primal, and Verse.
So yeah, our Arcane, Divine, and Primal, the big three, just makes sense to have, especially in a world that is so infused with magic. And I think that there are some important distinctions in the actual system between the three that I like, and I didn't want to tinker with. The inclusion of Verse was honestly because I like bards, and I like bards being a part of the setting. And I was like, well, Terranoth did it, so great. I'll bring that over. I don't need runes, so I'll leave that out. And it turns out, just by virtue of throwing in verse, honestly, at the last second, one of our players, Trevor, took the Bard talent at character creation and was like, yeah, I want to do that. And was like, awesome. I'm glad I included that then. But I feel like this gives you your standard D&D style fantasy setting. If you go with arcane, divine, primal, and verse, that covers pretty much all your bases in terms of that style of storytelling and style of game.
Now, one of the things that as we've just wrapped up a massive series on magic, and I don't want to get into magic. We'll have future segments of Eberron Reforged on that. But when it comes to your decision, we talk about how knowledge is used to in the additional effects tables for all the various spells. And just really quick, I'm assuming to a large degree, Arcana, Divine, Primal, and Verse. The spells, by and large, are going to function identically as we see them in the core rulebook, the expanded player's guide, and Terranoth, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
We had to figure out what from the EPG worked with verse, because that wasn't made clear. But other than that, we just pulled everything whole cloth.
Okay, well, I'm eager to talk about that in a future episode then. But one of the things I do want to mention, because we're on the subject of skills, is the additional effects for spells are driven by knowledge. Okay, but for you, did you pick a particular knowledge skill for all magic skills to be keyed off of for those extra additional effect abilities?
Yeah.
Or did you make it unique for each?
I made it unique for each magic skill, because once again, that just made sense. Arcana and Divine share lore as their knowledge skill that they ping off of. Once again, that idea of combining the Arcana knowledge skill and the religion skill. And then for Primal, went with nature, once again, making too much sense for my own good. Verse, I decided to go with society, which that one I kind of kicked around. I didn't want another one pinged off of lore. I already hated myself enough for doing two to ping off the same knowledge skill. So I thought, what made the most sense for verse? And, I think I may have been watching The Witcher at the time. And so seeing this bard through courts and knowing how to navigate, he presumed he knew how to navigate, but on that show, he most certainly did not. But I like the idea of a bard's magic skill pinging off of how well they know how to play to a crowd and how well they know their
fantastic audience. Yeah, that's absolutely fantastic. Yes.
So I went with society for that. And then for artifice, I went with adventuring, because that's the artificer. They're the ones out in the wilds, looking through ancient temples and trekking into long forgotten places to discover ancient magic. And it just made sense that their magic would ping off of their knowledge of the adventuring world around them.
So talk to us then about artifice. First of all, what characteristic does it key off of? Is it intellect the same way Arcana is?
Yes, it is intellect. Okay. Pings off of intellect, and artifice went through, I think, 3 or 4 different facelifts, different iterations, and not even iterations. That's being too generous. Different complete overhauls, because I remember an early conversation with you when I had first decided to do this, and I was diving deep into the artificer because I knew Philip was going to want to play one. And I was like, so I'm thinking about using the Android rules to like do magic hacking and all this stuff. And I remember you just going, you just no, stop. It's a spellcaster. Stop. You're making it way too hard on yourself. And so I took about 5 steps back. And when we initially started off the campaign, it was operated like just another magic skill, where we had decided everything except for attack and heal were the 2 spells that it did not have access to. Because once again, for your listeners that don't know Eberron that well, the notable thing about the artificer as a caster is they cast their magic on items. They don't cast it on people. And so if, to borrow D&D terms, if a artificer is casting Bull's Rush on the fighter in the party, they're not casting it on the fighter, they're casting it on their breastplate. And their breastplate is what has this emboldened fortitude moving forward. And so removing attack and heal made sense because you can't affect organic things. And then when Keyforge came out after our first set of episodes, we once again threw everything out the window and we're like, hey, this amber thing is really neat. Let's do that. So the Artificer has been probably the hardest part of this conversion, trying to figure out what it looks like to be, I don't want to say faithful to the D&D version, because that's a mistake to frame it in that way. That way leads to ruin. But just to try and live up to the reputation and the flavor of the Artificer class and what they can do.
I can only imagine, and I'm eager to get into that in extreme detail. I know that's probably going to be one of our segments coming up.
Yeah,
but okay, okay. Well, Eric, we've been jawing about this for a while now, and it's been very intriguing to see your thought process and have you walk through this with us, and hopefully our listeners have learned a great deal by seeing this in practice. I really want to close by asking you to talk to us about your overarching goals during skill definition. What were the, things we haven't discussed? What were the general guidelines and principles that really guided you on this? Because I think understanding that journey is going to help a lot of other writers and GMs out there who are trying to do the same thing. Yeah,
the number one thing is Eberron is such a beloved setting because you can do virtually any type of campaign in it. You could reasonably take a pre-written adventure set in Android, Terranoth, Twilight Empire, Star Wars, and easily adapt it to work in Eberron, just because of how the magic works and how pervasive it is and how it can just kind of whole cloth replace technology. But the trap there is to overload it. With, like I referenced, magical computers in the form of arcane locks to bring in the hacking rules, or using runes from Terranoth as dragon shards. And so having that focus, especially if you are doing a conversion for a campaign for your table at home, what do you need now? What do you need in terms of skills? Because once again, I was going to have to create a whole new skill for some kind of magical hacking, and I didn't have to do that because of your sage wisdom. So the goal was to provide a wonderfully unfocused setting, if that makes sense, by providing focus in the skill list, to bring everything together in such a way to where this skill list could be used in a high fantasy setting, one adventure, and then turn around to the next session into a gritty urban underworld. Without missing a beat, without needing to go, oh crap, we need this skill now. So having that lack of focus really helped define the campaign and help define Eberron in Genesys.
Very well said.
Thank you.
Well, Eric, thank you for joining us for this inaugural segment of Eberron Reforged. I can't wait to have you on in future shows to dive into some of the other nitty gritties, because now that we understand the general skill choices you've made, we got a lot more to discuss. Yeah. And I haven't even asked you about this yet, but maybe you could tease us what because you're I mean, for listeners, Eric's the one driving this in terms of what content to share with us. Where are we going to go next, Eric? What are we going to talk about next?
Well, I think it only makes sense, like we talked about, defining your skills. Like, you have to do that in order to start creating the other things. And I think the number one thing that skills play into are your careers. And I think getting into listening to your players about what they want to play in the setting and using that alongside your skill list to create an interesting career that they're going to be excited to use is probably a next good step to take.
I can't wait to have that career discussion. Well, we will discuss it with you next time. So thank you again for joining us.
Well, that was really, really informative and cool. I can't wait to see what...
Did you enjoy that? Yeah.
I did.
I mean, and honestly, guys and listeners, we expect this segment to be about 30 minutes. We had an extra 10 minutes tacked onto it, so it's a bit longer than we would normally like for that segment, just because we really kind of had to intro things for you all.
Yep.
But, we kind of expected this segment to be about 30 minutes, on its recurring basis. But I cannot wait to get into careers next time we talk with Eric.
Yeah.
The sheer amount of work they've done is incredible. But I don't know. I found the process very insightful.
Yep. Absolutely. And to be able to then use the information that they've got, or the listeners, as well as what Eric's got, to then go and listen to Eberron Renewed. It sort of gives them a little bit of background to it as well. So yeah, very, very helpful. It's a great segment. Well done.
I can't wait for more. I can't wait for more. You know what else I can't wait for?
What's that?
Sliding my way under the hammer.
I didn't know where you were going with that.
I'll see. I'm the master of unexpected segues.
Indeed, you are.
Under the Hammer.
And welcome to Under the Hammer, the segment where we answer your games and rules questions about the Genesys RPG as it impacts both rules, content creation, and play. And we've got some great questions this week, with a couple coming from our Patreon supporters. Now, of course, if you would like to join them and get your questions to run to the top of the queue, visit patreon.com/Forged Genesys and become a Tier 2 supporter today. All right, Chris, what's our first question?
Well, it comes in from Dave Foster via our Patreon Discord.
I swear that's like the best Australian name ever. Well, apart from the Foster's thing, that stuff tastes terrible. I don't know if you've ever tried it, but it's like your Bud Light, but worse.
It's worse. It's skunky. I don't care. I don't care for it. You
Anyway,
just need a commercial they used to broadcast here. It was like Foster's Australian for beer.
Oh my God, really?
Yeah,
It's Foster's for bleh.
Yeah,
Anyway.
it was like this big Crocodile Dundee looking dude like slam a giant can of Foster's down on a bar in the outback, and it'd be like, Foster's, it's Australian for beer.
No, it's definitely not. Anyway, I digress. Go on with Dave's question.
Dave says the following. Hi, guys. Love the show and have almost caught up. I referred to the rules for strain recovery after an encounter. Core Rulebook, page 117. Which don't have anything to say about spending advantage or triumph on these rolls. Do they simply wash? Or may they also be used to heal strain as in combat and narrative play? Looking at the rules for interpreting the pool, which is in the core rulebook, page 23, it's implied that advantage from any rolled dice pool can be used to recover strain. This begs the question, do the strain recovery rules exist outside or in conjunction with the rules for typical dice rolls? What are your thoughts? Thanks.
That's a great tin of worms to open up.
Boy, howdy.
Now, I did a little bit of research in relation to this as well, and it's pretty interesting. He's absolutely right. It can be that advantages can be used to recover strain because it's another dice roll. It's a dice pool rolled. The interesting thing is, and I'd be interested to hear what you have to say on this, Chris.
I have some strong opinions.
Is that in the Star Wars RPG and in all three books, it talks about spending advantage to recover strain, and it also talks about threat being used to cause strain during narrative encounters. And one of the things that it mentions in the Star Wars books is there's a nice little bracket behind it in parentheses that says can be used multiple times. That is not there in Genesys in either.
No.
So that begs the question, can you, in that sort of a scenario where you are doing strain recovery after an encounter, can you only do it once? So if you roll 3 advantages, you can only ever spend that one advantage to add on an additional point of strain.
No.
It's an interesting one.
No, I say it with me. Say it louder for the back in the class. Always err on the side of the player.
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Here's the deal. Rules is written. Only successes heal strain at that strain recovery roll you make at the end of the encounter. Mm. The rules also say that when you make a roll, you can spend advantage to recover strain.
Mm-hmm.
In my games from Star Wars 8 years past and into Genesys now, I allow both strain and I allow both successes and advantage to be spent to recover strain.
Mm.
if I find it fitting, I find it rewarding, and it has never, ever, ever caused a problem in my game. You roll 3 advantage. Guess what? You just recover 3 strains. Congratulations. As far as triumph goes, I mean, it's a check. How would you normally spend a triumph on a check? You got to think about that too. I've done some very creative things with triumph. I've allowed players to not necessarily heal, but ignore for a period of time the effects of an ongoing critical injury if they're suffering one. That's a common way I've spent triumph on a strain recovery check. But there's all kinds of other interesting things you can do. You can maybe upgrade the check that another character is about to make as you provide them with witty banter or repartee as they're about to recover their own strain, which could seriously help things out a lot.
Right.
But he's got multiple facets to this question, right? The first one is spending advantage or triumph on those after encounter strain recovery rolls, and that's my opinion on it. He also wants to know, can they be used to heal strain as in combat and narrative play? I think we've covered that as well. And the last part of it is, do strain recovery rules exist outside of or in conjunction with the rules for typical dice rolls? Well, I think honestly, although I haven't directly said it, I mean, it's my opinion that they work in conjunction. I mean, I don't know. I mean, people might disagree with me, but this is how I've been running it for years. It's never, ever caused a problem. Ever. Never, ever, 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 ever. The only hitch in the giddy up I got with this is there's a related question. Can you? Okay, how do I? Julio, I can explain this best by example. Okay. Let's say you have a party, and they just got through a hairy combat encounter, and they rolled to recover strain, and they made their rolls, and they didn't get as much strain recovery as they wanted, and they're sad. And so 5 minutes of game time go by, and they're walking through, and they're not to the next encounter yet, and one of the players says, "I want to make a perception roll to see if I see anything," and you go, okay. And they make the roll. It's like, I failed with 4 advantage. I'm going to use that 4 advantage to heal 4 strain. Okay.
Yeah.
This isn't directly related to Dave's question, but this is the shenaniganry that can happen if you start getting a little too lax in some players' minds, but they're worried about the wrong thing.
Yep.
The problem is that you allowed him to roll when it didn't matter.
That's one part.
That's the problem. That's the real problem.
Right.
But I mean, honestly, that's the bigger concern. That's the only time I've repeatedly had to adjust player expectations, to put it nicely, at my table over the last 7 years.
Yep. There's an interesting quandary to all of this, though. I like it that there is consistency with rules. Okay. That you don't have to be a rules lawyer and, bash your players over the head with it all the time. That's just not the point of the game. The game is to have fun, to tell a great story and move on. If you do it as we're suggesting, where you can use advantages like that, what happens with initiative? Because initiative is another dice roll. It's a dice pool. It's based on your skill. It's just that there's no difficulty. So you're rolling that, and it talks about advantages being used to, and I'll explain, because this is what was suggested in one of my campaigns, and we ran it that way, and it was great. That there is specific, when it comes to triumphs, that in that it specifically says you can use a triumph to take an additional maneuver. Okay?
Yes.
But it doesn't say that about advantages. Okay. But the normal rules say that if you roll 2 advantages, you can get an additional maneuver. What I have seen done in my games, and it's worked perfectly well, and both parties have done it, I've not worried about doing it for NPCs because it's more paperwork that I don't want to have to deal with. But I've seen players that have seen that they're not really going to be part of the top of the pool, and so they say that they've rolled, let's say that they've rolled 1 advantage and 3 successes, but just 1 advantage, and they know that it's not really going to affect the outcome too much. So what they will do is they will go, can I spend that advantage to gain a point of strain, or can I use that advantage to somehow affect the story so that there just happens to be cover over there that we could get to within a maneuver? That sort of stuff. I guess it depends on the scenario, but we used to do it all the time, and there was never a problem with it.
Really?
And that sort of applies. But the thing is that if you use that advantage, that's it. It's gone. You can't use that then to so if you had 3 advantages and you decided to use 2 of them, you're down to 1 advantage. On
the initiative roll.
On the initiative roll, because you've already pre-spent that advantage.
Yeah.
It's difficult.
Look,
it really is difficult.
What's good for the goose is good for the gander, I guess. If it works in your games, do it. I would never do that.
Right.
But that's because advantages and how they're spent for initiative rolls are very clearly defined. That like, this is exactly how you do it. Furthermore, for me, it's a bit of a narrative break, and I'll explain. And this is something else you got to consider, guys. When you spend advantage on a check to recover strain, all right, what you are doing is when you're making a check, it's in a stressful situation, okay, and you have found some type of inner strength to recover some of that exhaustion as a part of the stressful situation. You know, you may not have succeeded, but you did well enough to where you've bolstered yourself, basically. Or you did so well and that you've been proud of yourself when you've bolstered yourself and you recover some energy, you recover some strain. That's how I've always done it. With initiative, from a narrative standpoint, I have a really hard time applying that justification. So I don't know. If it works in your game, holla. But I think, and this is the thing about house rules. You use what works for your players in your game, and you do what you got to do.
Yeah,
I think Hulu's crazy.
I mean, it basically really is a case of it works until it doesn't. Because no doubt it's going to come up somewhere. And I mean, there's even a talent that is in Keyforge that allows you to spend a triumph in an initiative roll in a certain way, which basically means that how they've written it in the rules is that when it comes to initiative, the advantage is just purely there for the tiebreaker. The number of successes works out exactly where you are. And then the triumph is used predominantly, unless you have this new talent, to take a maneuver. And as you said before, it's very, very specific. And I guess when it comes to you spending advantages in the Australian recovery, it's not very specific. So, maybe that's the destruction of that argument, but I don't know. Interesting discussion, though.
Interesting discussion. I hope, Dave, our discussion has helped answer your question somewhat.
Indeed. Now, our next question comes from Kevin Pfeiffer.
Pfeiffer.
Sorry, what is it?
Pfeiffer.
Oh, Pfeiffer. Is that how it's pronounced? Oh,
you actually met him at Gamer Nation Con.
Yes, I know Kevin. I actually played with Kevin. Sorry, Kevin. You're going to hate me now. Anyway, moving on. So he asked via Facebook. So I was listening to my backlog of episodes of The Forge, and you guys mentioned the interaction between signature spell and implements again, and it got me thinking, which is always dangerous. I know what you mean. While I agree that implements can't add more free additional effects to the signature spell, what I started wondering is if they can still reduce the difficulty of a signature spell with matching additional effects. I realized I haven't heard this discussion yet. My initial reaction is that they absolutely can, but I wanted your take on it. As an example, a PC has signature spell attack with range, deadly and destructive, and uses a magic staff. Natural difficulty is formidable, and the talent reduces the difficulty once to daunting, and the staff reduces the difficulty once to hard, maybe. The staff isn't granting a new ingredient to the recipe. Range is still limited to medium, but I don't see a reason to prevent it from applying its effects to the existing range effect. It seems thematic for a caster to choose an implement that complements their signature spell. I know this is a frequent question, and you guys have thought it through much more thoroughly than I have. Thanks.
Damn.
It's an interesting one. What's your thoughts?
So let me start by saying it's rules as written at this point. I have talked to so many GMs at this point. that have banned the signature spell talent from their game. And you can go into the interwebs and find all kinds of great discussions about how signature spell is just broken and overpowered.
And some not so great.
Most of them are not so great.
Yeah, this is the internet after all.
This is the internet. And I have a hard time. I mean, and the reason is because you start bringing in stuff. Well, what about this? Well, what about that? Well, what about this? Well, what about that? In a perfect world on its own, it works fine. But when you start bringing in stuff like this, it starts to get really crazy. And the ability to have relatively inexpensive and easy to find implement like a magic staff and a very low level talent allow you to turn a 5 purple spell into 3 purples is dang. That's a bit hard for me to swallow, Kev.
I agree.
I mean, I always say, and I just said it and screamed it before, err on the side of the players always. So what I would, if you're gonna, I mean, I would say try it with the caveat to the player that if I find this to be imbalancing, it's ending. Yeah. I mean, Hooli, what do you think, man?
Well, basically what he's saying there is that it's okay to give a first level character a fireball in D&D, if you want to put it into those sort of terms. So if a first level character is coming up to a horde of kobolds, you let them have a fireball. Don't complain when they're all dead and that's destroyed your encounter for the night. The same sort of thing applies here, is that obviously you want your characters to progress with their power in the same sort of way that you would any other type of role-playing game, that as they get more experience, they get better at what they do. Giving them everything right from the get-go is a really bad idea for a number of reasons. The first of which is that it's going to break your game. Second of which, I think, is that you want your players, especially if they're new to the game, you want them to be able to absorb the rules as they're going. And the best way to do that is that they start low, where they don't have a lot of stuff that they have to overcomplicate things with. And then as the story progresses, they get better and better and better at it. So they've got the rules that they have to learn first. They don't want to have to know all about the 10 different signature spells or things that they've got. You want to make it as simple as possible. So, and I know that I've experienced that myself with some other games, especially D&D, where you get invited to a group and they say, "Oh, we're all 17th level. Great, thanks." I have no idea what I'm doing. That was the first game that I ever played 5th edition in, was a 17th level campaign, and I'm just going, I've got no idea. So, and that just overwhelms people and puts people off. So when it comes to these sorts of things, just, steady, I think. So, but as far as this, I agree with you 100%. I think the signature spell as written is totally fine. There's nothing that gets added to it. It is something that character has. It's really good, I think, if you are sort of that lower level, to have a spell that you're really good at, and it's really good for healers and stuff like that. But when it comes to, starting to bring in these easy to find things, it's just going to break your game. And as you say, this is the reason why people have gone, signature spell, no.
Okay, so why do professional athletes, and I'll use the most white bread example I can think of, tennis players.
Right.
Why do professional tennis players insist on having the same racket every single time they play? Same brand, same weight, same grip, same everything. Why? Why do they insist on that?
I honestly don't know. I don't follow tennis.
Well, no. Why would any athlete insist on having the precise piece of equipment they need for whatever? I mean, a baseball player, a bat. Yep. Okay. For a footballer, the exact same pair of shoes that fit the exact same way with the precise cleats. It has to be the same every time they play. This is a common thing. Why do athletes need that? It
enhances their own ability. It works with that to make them a better athlete. Simple.
Oh, no.
Okay.
Wrong answer. No, it's the wrong answer. Holy. Well, neither you or I are very athletic, so it's very simple. And it provides consistency.
Right.
Okay.
Mhm.
It comes down to most things for professional athletes, muscle memory. Okay.
Right. Mhm.
When I'm making a tennis serve, when I'm trying to hit a line drive or a home run, when I am making that perfect corner kick, I am so practiced at that activity that it is muscle memory. And that's how I can do it with ease, that perfect thing. And if I screw with the variable in any way, I'm off my game. If my racket's too heavy, if my bat is the wrong size, if my shoes are too tight or the cleat pattern is not correct, I've just screwed it up. Signature spell to me is the mage's equivalent of muscle memory. This is one thing that you know how to do, kabam, instantly. That is why you're able to do it at that reduced difficulty. When you add anything to it, including an implement, in my opinion, it's the same thing as using a different bat or a different cleat or a different, shoe or a different racket or whatever it is. It's the same thing. It's going to jack with the balance. That's how I, from a narrative perspective, am not a fan of it.
That's a very good point. I had not considered that at all. Very good point. Very good point. But it also backs up what we said, that don't do it.
Don't do it.
Look,
or try it and then watch it break your game and then don't do it.
Look, something could be said, because obviously any sort of weapon does have hard points. So if you want to go down that path, perhaps that there is some sort of attachment, whether it be a gemstone or something like that, that allows that to happen. But there's going to be a massive quest involved to do that. But there's also another quest which is more important to the story. So let the players have a choice as to which direction they want to do. Help the mage improve themselves so that they can do this funky thing, or go down the path. And if they decide to go down the path of getting that funky thing for the mage's staff, have some sort of consequence occur because they didn't go down and do the right thing.
I think a piece of equipment is a great suggestion. A newly minted, freshly created tier 4 or tier 5 talent could be another option. Maybe, you know what? We have improved signature spell, right? Sounds like a supreme signature spell to me. Allows you to use an implement with your signature spell. Okay. That's another option. And, honestly, because then again, the worry and the fear and the game balance, I don't care anymore when you're talking about a character that has access to tier 5 talents. At that point, they've buttered their bread. At that point, they've earned their stripes. So they're going to make that 5 purple check anyway, most likely. So really, all the implement's doing is making sure they'll get an extra success or two. Anyway, good questions.
Very good questions. I like them.
But Hooli, I'm afraid that does unfortunately bring us to the end of yet another show. And we had said at the start of the show we were going to keep this to 2 hours, and I know we've exceeded that. We're probably pushing 2:30 at this point, I would imagine. But with the announcement section we had to have and the products we had to go through, holy moly.
Not that I'm objecting at all to people giving brand new products. It's great stuff that's appearing on there. Forgetting some of my little complaints, the stuff that's getting out there is absolutely fantastic. So well done to all of the authors. And if you're just listening to this show, and I know that there are a few of you out there who really want to put stuff out there, but haven't done so yet, and yes, I'm included, bite the bullet and actually just put something out there. If you need some advice, we are here. That's one of our Patreon levels. We can help you out with that. But hey, look, even if you just throw us some ideas that you want, if you see us on Facebook or something like that, we're more than always happy to throw in our 50 cents worth. So yeah, something in there.
Absolutely.
But anyway, it does bring it to the end of the show, unfortunately, as you said, Chris. But we will be back with a new episode in short order, in which we'll return to die casting with a look at the alchemy skill, which is really exciting. What you can do with it, what you shouldn't do with it, and what furiously insanity you can boil over. Can't wait.
I'm really looking forward to that. But I'm also looking forward, Gamer Nation, to a forthcoming show dedicated to a deep dive of Secrets of the Crucible, which will, of course, have some very special guests. And honestly, now that the book is out, it's in everyone's grubby hands, whether it's digitally or physically. We've got that on the docket as well, guys. And while we are lining up scheduling for our guests, we want your questions about the book starting now. So if you have any questions or topics related to Secrets of the Crucible, or any other questions about Genesys or gaming in general, for that matter, we want you to contact us. And Hooli, how should they do that?
Well, they can email us at forgegenesis@d20radio.com, or they can post it up via one of the many social media platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Reddit, as you like to say. I can't roll R's like you can. Exactly, by searching at Forge Genesis. We've also been having some great conversations on the D20 Radio Discord channel, and of course, truly dedicated conversations with our Patreons on our very own podcast Discord server.
And we'd love to hear from you all. Don't forget you can also join the even larger discussion in the D20 Radio Facebook group, where we nerds congregate to cross-pollinate. And don't forget to give us a like or a follow as well on any of our social media sites. You can also drop us a review on those sites for your favorite podcatcher, including iTunes and even Spotify. You can also visit our website at forgegenesis.com.
Well, that is a wrap for us, and that's a short show. Yay, I can't wait to edit this. Thank you all for listening, and we hope you will join us next time as we continue to explore the Genesys Role Playing Game. I'm GM Hurley. May your triumphs be many and your despairs be few.
And I'm GM Chris, wishing you peace, love, and good.
Thanks again for joining us, and remember, the Forge Podcast, helping you hone your gaming edge. The Forge, a Genesys podcast, is a proud member of the D20 Radio Network. For more information about the network, visit www.d20radio.com. The Forge is a fan-generated podcast. All the information provided on the podcast, the social media, and related website is not affiliated with Fantasy Flight Games or any of their licensors. The content of this podcast remains the property of the Forge, a Genesys RPG podcast, and is intended for educational and informational purposes only. The Genesys Role Playing Game, Genesys logo, Genesys Foundry, content, and all material remain the property of Fantasy Flight Games. All products available on the Genesys Foundry website remain the property of their respective companies and individuals. For more information about the Forge, the Genesys RPG podcast, visit www.forgegenesis.com.